Hey friends, it's me, Mr. Rosa, back with another chapter of Pax by Sarah Pennypacker, illustrated by John Clausen. Today I'm reading from another one of my favorite spots. This is the inside of my 1963 Mercury Monterey, my favorite car. Working on it to get it ready again for the summer. Got a little bit to do today, but yeah, was out here, so I thought I would read to you from the inside of my classic. So, without further ado, let's get started with Chapter 4 of Pax. Not hunting for his grandfather's flashlight was the first mistake of the trip. The moon had lit Peter's way for maybe 2 hours before it had drowned beneath the thick clouds. He'd stumbled along in the dark for another hour before giving up. He'd slit open the sides of a garbage bag to make a long mat and cut the other to wear as a poncho against the cold mist, and slept beside a culvert, his mitt for a pillow. Actually, slept was a wild overstatement. And when the first low rays stabbed his eyelids, he'd awaken cold and wet from whatever dozing he'd managed. His first thoughts were of Pax. Where was he this morning? Was he cold and wet too? Was he afraid? "I'm coming," he said out loud as he rolled the garbage bags back into his pack. "Hold on!" He ate a stick of cheese and a couple of crackers, sludged along a long drink of water, then laced his boots and climbed up to the road. He was stiff and sore, but at least his anxiety had relaxed its grip. He probably hadn't traveled much more than 7 or 8 miles, but there was still a whole day before his grandfather would get home from work and even suspect he was gone. According to his atlas map, he probably had another 20 miles to go before hitting the highway. After that, he could turn west for the shortcut anywhere that looked promising. He'd sleep deep in the woods tonight, out of civilization. The riskiest part of the trip behind him. He'd wish he'd paid more attention as he'd driven with his father the day before. Mistake number 2. But he only recalled there had been a single sleepy town right after they'd exited the highway, and then stretches of woodlands broken only by occasional farms. Peter walked for 5 full hours. Blisters formed on his heels, and his shoulders ached from the pack. But every step brought him closer to Pax, and the home he shouldn't have never left, and he felt hopeful. Until a little after noon, when he hit a cluster of buildings that passed for a town square. Immediately, it seemed every person he passed was eyeing him suspiciously, wondering why he wasn't in the school he'd noticed a little while back. When a woman dragging a toddler stopped to stare outright, Peter pretended to study the window display in the hardware store beside him. In the glass he saw his reflections, and the remnants of his hopeful mood melted. His hair was tangled with leaves, his sweatshirt streaked in mud, and his nose reddened with what promised to be a full-face sunburn by the end of the day. The kid in the window looked like a runaway, one who hadn't prepared very well. He sensed the woman moving on, but before he could leave, a shadow loomed over his shoulder. "Need something, young man?" Peter looked up. A man in a blue jacket emblazoned with the store logo stood in the doorway smoking. His arms were crossed over a saggy belly, and his hair was a thinning gray, but something about the way he was peering down his nose reminded Peter of a hawk he'd once been searching he'd once seen searching for prey from the top of a cedar. He pointed to the window. Peter looked back at the display. Seed packets and gardening tools. Oh no, I was just, do you sell flashlights? The man cocked his head and eyed Peter while he took a drag on his cigarette. And then Peter was reminded of the hawk. Finally, he nodded. Aisle 7. No school today? Lunch break. Gotta hurry back. The man stubbed out his cigarette and followed him inside, hovering nearby while Peter chose the cheapest flashlight on the rack and a pack of double A's, and even shadowed him as he checked out. Outside, Peter let out the breath he hadn't known he'd been holding. He wedged everything into his pack and headed for the intersection. Hey, kid! Peter froze. The man had followed him outside. He yanked a thumb over his shoulder. School's that way. Peter waved and smiled, trying to act dopey, and changed direction. At the corner, he'd risked a glance over his shoulder. The man was still watching him. Peter took off, sudden trickles of sweat chilling the back of his neck. He didn't stop running until he reached the school entrance, then cut for the parking lot. All he wanted to do was hide for a couple minutes, maybe crouch between a couple of pickups, and figure out an escape route. But beyond the parking lot and the utility buildings, he saw something a whole lot more appealing. A baseball diamond carved into the lime green spring grass, and tucked along the third baseline, facing away from the school, an empty dugout. Peter stood at the top of the rise, looking down at the sight. He argued with himself for only a minute. He'd like to be moving for sure, making time. But what if that guy had called the police? Hitting the road would be risky. Any time he'd rested, he could easily make up at night, since he had a flashlight now. And he was suddenly tired, bone dead tired. Mostly, though, it was the way the field looked so welcoming, as if it were inviting him in. Peter always felt good on a baseball field, and maybe that was a sign. He didn't think he believed in signs, but after the Coyotes last night, he wasn't sure he didn't. Peter adjusted his backpack, loped down the hill. In the dugout, the familiar mingled sense of leather, sweat, and stale bubblegum wrapped around him like a hug. Peter hurried into his other sets of clothes and rubbed a handful of clay red dirt through his hair. When he left here, he sure wasn't going to look like any description the police might have. He filled his thermos from a water fountain, drank it all down, and filled it again. As he wiggled underneath the bench, he smiled, realizing that Pax would have chosen the same spot, protected, but with a good vantage point if he wanted a rest. An hour, that was all. Then he'd cut behind the school and pick up the road again. Enough time that if the police had been called, they'd lose interest. He arranged his baseball glove and lowered his head. Just an hour, he murmured. I won't even close my eyes. That, my friends, is the end of chapter 4. So my question to you today is, do you think that Peter is going to fall asleep, and for how long? Leave a message for me in the comments, or tell me something about the story you liked today. All right. Have a great day. See you tomorrow.